some things we learn from the development and from the stack development. This is me. So, really cool. I'm the head of the research. We are now 18, 19 people, so we're doing that. I am consulting for Latvians and host. So, that's it. If you want to join us, just let me know. And if you want to learn us, we can share later on the slides. Okay. I think this is your time. Egor.
Thank you.
The microphone.
Yes, sure.
Can everybody hear me?
Definitely.
Welcome. I'm Egor Kloos. I'm a solution architect at Sogeti. But I started 21 years ago as a design administrator. I started doing this kind of work specifically for the web. And then what I found out is that, well, if I want something to look a certain way, I also need to build it. And that's why everybody was doing everything. So at some point I started constructing a library, started making up stuff, and I found out that, well, I actually like making stuff with technology. So I started becoming a frontender. Actually, 8 years ago, I became a frontender 6 full time, now I'm doing more and more. But also helping the designers and the business and all the frontend developers to come together to really start making large scale products. So I've been doing stuff on the base, on the website, doing stuff for SMEs, and now I'm working with clients and finance. And what I found was, when I was making all these kinds of products, I understood that you can start repeating some of the work. I needed to start creating a framework. Of course, all the frameworks already existed, but they never quite did what I needed to do. So what I started doing was looking at frameworks. What do they do? They're very opinionated, they're very structured. The structure gives you a lot of speed. But also, you can add features to these structures and make it very simple. So you see something like other frameworks like Bootstrap, where they've already done a lot of abstraction. And you're looking at the code of Bootstrap to see, and that way, that knowledge gets shared with the framework. And you can do this yourself. You can actually use that code also to build your own framework. And so that way, you build stand on the shoulders of others. And be able to make your own structures without code. Some of the examples that I've worked with is the Gert's Foundation, Bootstrap, and the semantic humanity coming across as well. And these contain not just ways of working with templates, but they contain JavaScript and they contain animations. So these are all opinionated by the framework itself. They're not necessarily the animations and the look and feel of the company you're working for. And they also provide ways of skinning, so you can change the color, you can always change the font, you can't always change the typography. And so you end up having to hack into the framework, and then it becomes locked in. You can't replace it, you can't upgrade it very easily, people probably don't understand. And so when you're working in a team, you really start to understand that we need to make something ourselves. We need something that we understand. And like if you're experiencing building something in project, setting up a framework to start from detail and trying to work. And often it doesn't. And so we have a team of developers. The kind of new developers also really understand design, really understand the experience, and that they have the skills to actually do this. So you've seen splintering front-end development, one is really focused on applications, the other is basically focused on content design and websites. From encountering that, well, large companies actually use both. And so we can use the web framework to Angular, but then add very lightweight, customized interface framework to build the component on the. This is quite a useful way of attacking it because it's fairly simple and you only build what you need. You don't need a whole massive thousands of lines of code on the user interface. You're not probably going to use that. You really need to start looking at this now. And in some cases, you should really look at alternative templates. This is very, very simple. It's basically a way of adding things like, so I've used CCJS over the years, just to dynamically build parts of non-application widgets or components. And instead of false styles, so don't define everything, but define enough for you to have placeholders. So that way you can then add things later. And recently, components become a very particular way of working, and it's really impacted how user interfaces are actually built. And actually, the job is my work to accommodate that. One of the things that's consistent over the 20 years I've been doing this is web standards is always used. Angular became AngularJS because it was around Angular started improving things, it was backward compatible, and although these web frameworks are not necessarily web standard, which as application frameworks is not a big problem, but when it comes to the user interface, it really becomes a problem. You really need to focus on web standards, that's how browsers are built. And the web standards basically gives three core technologies, HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, but they also need to be accessible, and they also need to be secure, especially for large websites. So when I say on web standards, I will often include the content just to the guidelines thereof. Anybody use the OAuth? Maybe a top 10? It's something that pops up in interviews all the time, so it's a good thing to look through the occasionally look through the OAuth top 10 and see how this impacts your problem. So when I'm making these custom frameworks, usually I don't do that on my own, I usually do that with a group. Because I need buy-in from the developers to also make these frameworks work. So I look at, well, what parts are global, what parts are compartmentalized. So we can look at layout, which is usually quite universal over applications and websites. But then I can also look at useful parts that are much more smaller and focused and don't really need to worry about global stuff around it. But for that, you can be focused on functional design. So you have designers really focus on what the components actually do. And then you have other designers look at the identity. What does it look like? What does the user understand what's going before? And these things you can often set in global variables per website. And you swap out these variables per website so you can have a framework running across different websites. And then swapping out not all the variables, but just the global ones to specifically focus on layout and on the one of the big changes, one of the things that I've been using, why I've been using Bootstrap less, is that the layout model is actually changing. It's changing quite dramatically. So all these have a very particular way of working with the content that they container. So, especially grid is really quite impactful. What I found is that the container defines the layout. The element doesn't define any layout, it just defines itself. The container itself defines what its children are, how they are positioned. Not explicitly positioned, but the rules how they are going to be positioned. So when we look at Flexbox, a container that says it displays as a type flex. It's an inline system where blocks are positioned in line. Vertical, reverse, horizontal. And so you can actually determine which direction it is, what kind of orientation it's going to have. These are all defined in the container. You're not only elements itself. CSS Grid, which is now even becoming even more explicit that the container actually controls what the layout is going to be. And because CSS Grid if a browser works with CSS Grid, you can also have custom properties. So here I've used defined, like a mobile verse, I just defined all columns or the layout is the global part. The scoped part is then used, I use BEM. BEM is a structure for writing CSS. And that way I can scope the CSS to parts. I don't need to worry about the entire cascade. I use the cascade for the global parts for the layout, but for the components then I can really focus on using BEM. A lot of the web frameworks like Angular, React, and Vue. Vue is probably the most compatible with web components, especially if you just use the attributes. And then you see when you look at the documentation, they're very, very similar. And that way you can actually mix and match. So I've done some work on projects that you follow the kind of the micro front ends kind of approach, where you can actually just load in a different framework into a web component. So one framework can have React and another web component can have Vue, and they can just sit side by side because of encapsulation. Web components actually have a shadow DOM which actually encapsulates all the code into it. And so, coming back to templates, I can scope them with the block element modifier technique. Interesting, Bootstrap actually uses a very similar technique. It's also based on BEM, but have a different notation. And BEM is actually not new. This has been around for actually almost from the beginning. But when we started developing a lot of these websites, BEM became the one that was very consistent and very stable. Even very old code, I can read parts of the code that are written in BEM are very, very clear on what it does. So this is one of the reasons why it's become very popular. If you're writing your own code or your own components, using BEM is a very nice way of doing that. You see also like CSS modules and scoped components where CSS is really encapsulated into the component, but it isn't necessarily reusable dynamically. So the code is built, is compiled and bundled only for that section. And it's very difficult to use it on a different website, the same code, because the code only knows the build part where it's focused on the website itself. So doing it this way, the templates become much more reusable. So I start doing this a lot more. Very simple web component that has an attribute and a value. And then I just use a module and then load it in this way. And I often compile this down to either system register or a UMD kind of setup. Sometimes I use CommonJS, but I mainly use system register because system register maps modules from the ES6 approach almost explicitly. But what you see here is that you're basically defining what the element does within the web component. So I'm just extracting the template and inserting it. And then you can see in the previous one, I had the price actually already in the code. So the code actually already has an attribute. And you can use the web components to actually map the component attribute into your template. This is something that Vue and Vue.js and other frameworks have basically automated and made much more simple. But there's ways of doing it without these frameworks. And when you start very basically with no framework at all, no jQuery, no nothing, then you can say, okay, I built this, but now I need Angular, now I need React, and now I can build on top of it. And you can just throw the other stuff away because it was cheap and easy to make. And then nobody's going to cry over it. So you can actually build something very basic and then build something on top of it. And then you actually have a baseline for performance and those kinds of things. Line are just divs with events on them. That's it. There's no special tag. There's no input fields. It's all just divs with the framework actually maps it to it. Some frameworks actually don't map all the inputs, but they actually abstract the form away, and it makes it more difficult to use. It's mainly because async becomes a little bit easier. And so this is what a form looks like. Anybody used a legend in this way? So I've done this a few years ago. Hayden Pickering has actually made a website with all these kinds of stuff that actually really basic out of the box and always works. And there's no styling on it, and then you can just add your own BEM class names onto it and actually style it any way you want. And this is also extremely accessible. And I actually write most of my own validation code as well. So once you have parts of that, understanding how forms actually validate or how they actually don't validate, because a lot of forms are actually still quite buggy and don't work the same way across browsers. Understanding that makes this much more simple. And then you can actually start understand when you want to add another framework on top of it, or remove it, or add it, or change it, or keep it. This is a website I made early in the year for one of my customers. And this has no framework. It has components that do API calls. It has different kinds of layouts. It has components. It has special blog layout. All of this has there's no Bootstrap. There's no jQuery. There's no React. There's nothing. One of the reasons was the style sheet on this is 7K. If I use Bootstrap, it's like 40, 50K. So just doing that reduces a lot of the footprint of your website. And doing that with everything really reduces the load on the browser. And so the key thing I wanted to do with this is actually make the website really, really fast. So if we add a framework, we add a baseline where to work from. This is how fast a website can be. I add a Vue.js, as we're doing at the moment. We're actually transitioning to a Vue.js on this website. We have a baseline how fast it's going to be, and Vue.js is going to have to match that. And you can, and when you look at these frameworks, you can actually configure them in a way that they're really light and really fast, but you really have to think about it. And this way, I did this whole website within a month. And so that way, it's just cheap and easy to throw away. You can just replace stuff. Nobody's going to cry about it, so I'm not going to cry about it. But I want the site to become better, so I use different frameworks, and then I understand how these frameworks work. This is a page that has all these kind of components. The search was a separate component with an API call, different content from different, and these are all dynamically loaded. These are not bundled. So you can actually have 10, 20 components that are all dynamically loaded because they're all based on user interaction. And because it's user interaction, they don't have to be instant. You can wait a few seconds before people interact. When people switch a page, it takes a few seconds for them to actually interact it. They see it immediately, but they don't interact with it straight away. And so I'm looking, so what's next? I'm really looking at more custom properties. Only at the moment, I'm only using with Grid because they have the same compatibility in browsers. But as soon as IE11 disappears, custom properties become very valuable in components. So you can actually load an agnostic piece of CSS and a component to say, well, these are the properties that go into it. And then you can actually make an even lower footprint on your components and make them much more transportable to different parts, different websites even. And subgrids is probably going to really force people to understand how container layout works, because then it's still going to be a cascade, but now it's going to cascade the grid into the children containers, and that's really going to be something that's going to be very powerful, but it's also going to be very messy in the beginning. I hear some of the UI framework teams are actually looking at how they're going to transition to these technologies. But start playing with them now because they're going to be very relevant, if not already very relevant today. We probably can have a few questions. Yes?
You showed the example where you built the page completely vanilla, and now you're looking to move to JS. Can you say why? Kind of what is the functionality you're looking to unlock, or what is, why moving it to YouTube?
Yes, so a lot of the components are basically, the APIs are basically just read-only. They're just getting up data that's been stored somewhere. It changes, but it's still, for the browser, it's just a list of data. And what we're seeing is, now we want to add extra functionality, and then, okay, we need to store it. Oh, now we have state, we have roots. You could build out yourself if you're kind of weird, but the really thing is you really should look at frameworks that actually do all this heavy lifting for you. But you don't need to, if you're just making a one-page website, you don't need to use React to build it. If that one page needs to start doing all kinds of fancy things and needs to start working offline, okay, then start looking at frameworks that can help you do that. The user in the end is the goal, to service the user. Technology and the tools tend to service the developer. And so there's often a friction there on how to work with these tools and how to service the user. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, so kind of the first thing is somewhat of an MVP to show to the client, and then add functionality. Yeah,
well, an MVP, well, you show it to the client, but an MVP, even by its definition, is something you can actually use. So that's what this is. This is an actual website that users actually interact with cleanly, and now we can start thinking about, oh, this works. Now we can start adding stuff to it.
Cool. Thanks.
Yes?
Since you use web components, have you also looked at Polymer?
Yes, so actually, so when I built something, I just used web components, and then I'm looking at also like lit HTML parts, the parts that are in the Polymer project. Oh, that's cool, I'll take that out. What is it doing? Look at it. Because web components have all these callback functions that are abstracted away into these Polymer tooling as well, which is really quite useful, and it makes it kind of makes you, enables you to do some of this work now instead of waiting. So Polymer in that sense is very useful, but I don't necessarily use the whole thing. I keep an eye on it, and then especially in my homemade kind of cottage industry, making my own little frameworks, I kind of take the best bits out of different frameworks.
You looked into lit element?
Yeah, lit element is based on the lit HTML protocol they're working on, so that kind of really works quite nice. And it's really very clean, which is quite nice as well. So it doesn't really, and you can actually just plug it in. You don't need to use it only in the Polymer framework. You can just plug it in different places. Okay, thank you very much.
Very happy.
Yes, thanks, Igor. Well, Igor, thank you very much for talking today. Our next guest will be...
Yeah, what's going on?
Oh, wow. Introduction slide, of course. Big applause for Gert. He's the next speaker of us tonight.
Thanks.
Deze is nodig voor de video?
Voor de livestream, ja.
Kunnen we die box uitzetten?
Die kunnen we iets naar beneden zetten.
Ja. So I'm going to need a chair because I'll be live coding in a moment. All right, this looks good. All right. So first of all, who's using React? Pretty decent. Who's using web workers? Not so many. Well, okay, who's dabbled with it? Anyway, so web workers. For those who are not aware, web workers are a fairly new technology. It's a way to run scripts in a separate thread within the browser. Why is this useful? Well, sometimes you have scripts that take a while to load, they can be CPU intensive operations, and it might be good or pleasing for your users if that script does not block you. Service workers, although very similar. Service workers are things that are scripts which actually follow the worker standard, but they are meant to run in the background even while your page is not even in the foreground anymore, or not even the user has not even loaded your web page, but has loaded it in the past. So while web workers are meant to run really in parallel to your main JavaScript in a page. So what does this look like? Well, say we have just our main JavaScript file. It's fairly simple. You just define a new worker. You create a new worker instance. And then you can simply use the post message API to send messages to your worker and define an on-message handler to receive events coming from your worker. So to receive messages from the worker, which is then passed in as event.data. And finally, you can terminate your web worker if you want to. This is pretty much the entire API for web workers. What does this look like on the worker side of things? Fairly similar. It's pretty much the same thing. You define a non-message, but rather than on your worker, you define it on self, because that is the worker. Self is actually a keyword that only exists within workers and service workers. And you have the same post message API to send messages back to the browser. So this is pretty much it. I actually use this in an actual project at a customer. I'm currently working for Intergamma, which is the company behind Gamma and Karwei, the large DIY chains in the Netherlands. And we built a so-called zaagplanner, or a saw cutting service, which allows you to simply define a number of planks that you would like to have, like wooden planks, boards, that you would like to have cut. And it will calculate for you how to most efficiently cut this from the planks that we sell in the store. So if you want to build a cabinet, just provide it with the list of planks that you want, and it will tell you, okay, you need to go to the store, buy this, it will cost you this, and just go print this PDF and then bring it to the saw service in the store, and they will cut everything up for you, and you go home happily. All right, so what does this look like? This actually, let's see if this works well on this resolution. I think it's pretty okay. So it's fairly simple. You define the blanks that you would like to have, and it will calculate that for you. The thing is that this actually is calculating 100,000 random combinations that could be made with this setup, and then calculate the price for each of them and give you the cheapest one. So that is the way that we solved this, because this is an NP-hard problem. In fact, it's one of the NP-hard problems. It's called the bin packing problem. So the way that we solve this is just randomly calculate combinations. But of course, that will take a while. It can take a couple seconds depending on how many planks you want, because if you want more, it's going to take longer. Up to 100,000 random combinations, of course. So let's see if I can define some additional options. Let's say I want to leave these. You see, it takes a little while. I press this calculate button and it turns gray for a second. So this is the reason why I offloaded this work to a web worker, because I didn't want to run this stuff on the main thread. Of course, I hear you thinking, oh, why don't you just put this in a Lambda on AWS and then do a HTTP request? Oh yeah, sure, I could have done that, but it would not have been that much fun. Actually, we did that at first, and then I figured, oh, let's run it in the service worker instead, in a web worker. That's the example that I have. Now, let's write some code. Let's see how we did that. I'm just going to grab this. Because, I mean, I could talk about it all the way, but it's much nicer to just see it in the works, right? So let's switch to the other one. No, not that one. That one. All right, so I've set up this nice example. Does it work well? Yeah, sure. With a fairly basic React application. It's actually create React app, pretty much standard setup with an app component. And I've already prepared this a little bit to actually set up a worker instance, which is just running somewhere. The only thing that this worker does is send me back the message that I've just sent it with a 1 second delay. So it's really simple, it's just for demonstration purposes. So the first thing that we can define is, of course, the onMessage handler. And I've set up my worker, I'll show you in a second, to actually just send post message, worker reporting for duty, and you'll see the result on the left-hand side. So that's it, and you see it takes a timeout for 1 second, and it echoes my event data back. That's basically it. So But this is all fine and dandy, but I would of course like to communicate back and forth between my web worker and my page, and not just have it send me one piece of data. So how are we going to do that? Of course we're going to need to send use a post message API to send a message to that. So I could of course do that really simply. Do this.worker.post message and say hello. And then I save my file, and it will refresh on the left hand side. See, it takes a second before it echoes back my hello string. So, and of course in React, I would like to do this with a button on click. So equals this worker post message hello. Hello. And that'll be it. So now I have a button. I click it and it says hello. Still works like a charm. Alright, this still fairly simple. Just to go back a little bit, the best practice in React, for those who are unaware, is to use the component did mount lifecycle hook to set up the web worker when it starts. Because component did mount will render once my component is done mounting in the browser. So if you would also run the server side, it would not try to initialize a worker, because obviously that's impossible. Of course, we also need the other side of things. This component will unmount to terminate the web worker when it's done. So this.worker.terminate. We're not going to see it in action because it's not going to be going to unmount, but you just have to trust me. This is the way to do things, because you also should clean up after yourselves, obviously. Otherwise, you're going to have memory leaks or a lot of worker instances running for no purpose, because there is no one to talk to it with. So next up is I would really like to know that it is actually loading something or actually waiting for a response, because sometimes the process could take a while. I would like to show something like a spinner or a skeleton screen or something like that. So that's what I'm gonna go for now. But first, let's add some metadata to my component. Say I want to have an updated add property, which is undefined by default, and then when I receive a message, I'm also going to set updated add is a new date. So now let's chunk this down a little bit. So, of course, prettier does not agree. Yeah, that's better. If you're not aware, I'm using prettier, which is really awesome, because I hardly write any new lines or spaces or tabs anymore. I just save my file and it will automatically format stuff for me. So that's what you're seeing here. So obviously it still works, and it's updating the date that I'm receiving stuff at. On the other side of things, I would like to also keep track of when I'm sending data. So last post add, undefined, and then when I send the message, I also want to set some additional data. So in this case, this is not going to work anymore. I'm going to have to extract this stuff to say this.post message. I'll say hello. So rather than the worker, I'm just going to define a method on my class saying post message equals, and it receives a message. And then, I can make it just send this message, which will not do anything new. Just extracted the thing, but I'm gonna add some state. Set state. Last post add is new date. And well, this would be fine. A little nicer is to use the callback on the set state. You can pass a second argument to set state, which is actually a callback function, which will run after React has propagated your state. So that's a little nicer. And it will look actually like this. Let's see if I can force it to actually, well, let me fix that for you because it's a little bit annoying. Prettier print with 80 characters. Thank you. So that's better. So now I also should have last post at when I click the button. So if I have nothing and I click the button, I get the last post at as well. And you see it update when I click click this thing over here. Can I make it a little bit larger? Well, a little bit smaller, this one. All right, so next up is actually showing a loading indicator. And I could, of course, have introduced an isLoading Boolean flag to do this, which would have worked just as fine, probably. But the updated add and last post add gives you more flexibility. So I think it's a little nicer API. And of course, I can just use those two properties together to define this loading indicator. So what I can just do is say I'm going to show loading. And then last post at equals smaller than, is it smaller or larger? I always never know, but updated at, it's probably going to be the wrong way around, and of course it doesn't exist. I'm going to have to extract it from the state. Of course, I do destructuring for that, and now I'm going to have both properties, and you see it's the wrong way around, obviously. So let's just go. All right, so now when I click it, it's loading, loading, loading. So now I have a loading indicator. Next up, well, that was my loading indicator. Now comes the interesting part. A big thing to do when you're building React components is making sure that they are composable, that you can reuse this component in multiple situations, and that it's not tied into your one specific use case. That would be a good thing to do. The problem with this app component right now is that it contains a lot of business logic, which I would like to reuse. For example, if I want to communicate with some other worker as well, but it's tied into this view right over here. So how can I improve on that? So let's componentize this thing. So let's rename this to web worker, and then define a new app component that simply renders this web worker component that I've just created. And this should not do anything new, it still works. And the next up is to actually extract this view over here and just pass that as children to my web worker. So now it's broken, obviously. I need to say this, dot props children. And now it's broken. Why is that? Because last post add and updated add are not defined. These two are not defined. Why is that? Well, I've extracted them from their location. So now comes the interesting part. In React, there's a very powerful pattern called the render props pattern, which allows you to not only pass just a JSX, like a node, return a node, but actually return a function and call that from your component. So the trick here is to just take these two and make children a function. What does that look like when I'm using it? I'm just going to wrap it, arrow function, and there are my last post at my updated at again. And of course these two I need still this state. Now it's broken because I don't have this state over here. Let's just say data, and actually let's do this differently. I'm just going to return state entirely, and this should be data. And there it is. I don't have the entire JSON structure anymore, but just the message. Oh, it's broken. Why is that? post message is not defined. I should also pass that one. Post message is actually different because it's not part of state. It's a method. What I can do is two things. I can just add it to an object here, post message. This dot post message, and then expect it over here, post message. And are we good now? Yeah, we're good. The next up is I'm almost done making this web worker component really generic. But the only part left is to extract this one. That's actually the simplest one. Just say this.props URL. I'm just going to pass the URL over there. And now I've extracted away all the specific parts from this component and made a really generic one that you can easily reuse in a lot of situations. Now the interesting takeaway for those who are experienced in React development is that it's better to not pass a new object every time here. What I'm doing here is I'm creating a new object, spreading some stuff in there, and passing that to children, but it will ensure that every time when this renders, I'm going to re-render pass a new object to children. It would be better to only do that if there's actually an actual change. Now that I think I'm saying it, it's not actually, in this case, not going to happen, but I'll show you in a situation in a moment. So we've componentized this, abstracted away, and still working. Let's return to my introduction. Because this component I've just written is actually a component that I've released on NPM. Sorry, yeah, thanks. So you can use this component if you are going to be communicating with web workers from React. Just do a very simple npm install React web worker to do this yourself. So what does it do? A lot more than I've just shown. I mean, I can only live code so much in a short talk, but the web worker component that I've released does a lot more stuff. It actually allows you to, besides these render props that you've seen with the children or I'm passing a function, it also supports the React context API and provides some additional helper components which make it a lot more declarative and a lot less messing around with functions and inside your JSX and doing stuff like turning your statements around stuff being loading or not loading, or I'll show you an example in a moment. It provides a lot of additional data, such as timestamps, which you've seen on your messages, and also does error handling, of course. Provides some easy access to this last data, but also the entire list of messages that have been sent in the past, so you can, for example, count the number of messages that have been sent back and forth. So it provides, of course, the post message API, the updated last post add, but also an interesting addition is by default it does JSON serialization on the messages that you are sending back and forth. Because the worker API, the post message and on message APIs, it allows you to send actual objects back and forth between the two threads. But those will be the entire object structure. It's, I think it's called serializable or something in the spec. But that thing does a lot more than for example, JSON.stringify would do. It's more powerful, but that also makes it slower. So if you're going to send large data structures, it's better to JSON encode it before you're sending and then decode it in the worker side of things. So the web worker component I've built that does that out of the box by default. I've added some additional callbacks that you can pass, like onMessage and onError. For example, that you can use onError to do some logging back to your backend for logging purposes. You've seen me use this URL prop, and it will that means it will create a new worker instance in the onMount. You've seen me use that. But the downside of that is that this worker URL it's a variable, and your build system for your module bundler, for example, Webpack, is not able to optimize for that, or even automatically figure out the fact that you have a dependency on another file outside on another file. For example, Parcel, different package bundler, and you can access that way. What I've done in this demo is just have it in the public directory, but that means I can't do fancy ECMAScript 2018 stuff with it because it won't be Babelified. So if you do want to do that, you can just create your own worker instance outside of WebWorker and then pass that worker as a worker prop. And of course, service workers are also supported, what that actually does, it sets up a message channel for you and use that to communicate back and forth between your service worker and your web worker. You can check out the source code at github.com, Hengeveld Reg Web Worker, or just Google for Reg Web Worker and you'll find it. Where you see how this works with the message channel stuff. So going back here, this is what it can look like using the helper components that also are provided. You've seen me putting the children of WebWorker were a function in the example that I've provided, but I've also defined additional components: webworker.pending, webworker.data, webworker.error. Which will only render in the right scenario. So when there is an error, the webworker.error will render, and otherwise it won't. And this alleviates the pain of having to do checks within like checking if there is an error, then return this. Otherwise, the if statements within your JSX really are ugly. And ternary statements get messy really quickly, so I really like this API a lot more. And webworker.data will then just return your data rather than the entire component. So this is it. Thanks for your attention. I'm Gert Hengeveld. I'm a software consultant for Xebia. You can follow me at Hengeveld, Twitter, and etc. And thanks. Any questions?
Yeah, I have a question. I just wanted to clarify how it works, how web workers works on operational system level. I mean, must it be supported by the web browser?
Yes, yes. Yeah.
And what is the supportability of this? If going to implement this, how many people have it?
I don't know it by heart, but you can of course look it up. I would just go to caniuse.com or something like that, or NDN, and it will list the browsers that support it. I think it supports actually very high. Yeah, it's I think pretty much everything except IE9 or IE10. And IE11 already supports it. Yeah. So.
I can easily use it.
Yes, definitely. Don't back off from it for that reason.
Yeah, thanks a lot. So what happens if you like pass in the object which contains, like, for example, function there? Like if you pass in it to post message, if you send in something which contains, for example, object contains function, for example, like
yeah.
So it should fail, right?
Good question. I've not personally tried it with this JSON. It will obviously, like the JSON encoded, it will not work. of course, but I've not tried it, so it could actually be supported.
I mean, like, it doesn't make sense because you can transfer the code.
I mean, we can try, of course, if you want to know. I can, of course, just pass a function here and say, let's see what happens. So, console.log, is it going to work? I don't know. Live coding, right? I mean, what could possibly go wrong? I think it's one extra. Yeah. All right. So what this is going to do? I'm going to obviously need to look at my worker. It's going to event data. I don't have this JSON serialization in place in my demo, so that should be okay. All right. Let's. Data clone error.
Doesn't make sense.
Yeah. So no, you cannot pass a function.
What if you just unstringify the function? I mean, like, because you said that you use just unstringify, it should.
All right.
It should not fail on your one, right? It should be empty.
Sorry, I missed that last.
So, I mean, like, I believe that on your one, because you're using JSON.stringify, it shouldn't fail because you just.
No, it will just ignore it in the JSON stringify, of course. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
And the other question about like JSON stringify, you said that you've been using it to make it like sort of work faster, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
But I mean, it's anyway like it's compiled code, right? It shouldn't be like a lot of difference between the jobs that web worker to analyzing the object and.
You mean the transferring of data? I don't know the exact specifics, but there is quite a few blog posts that outline that have run benchmarks on the data, and of course with small data sets it's not going to be a problem at all. But if you send a large chunks of data, that's going to be it can be slower. Yeah, and it differs browser to browser. One guy tested it, and Chrome hardly matters between JSON stringify and just passing an object. But for Firefox it was a little bit slower, and in some scenarios up to 3 times slower. And Safari was also, for some reason, on Safari and iPhone was also really slow. So there are devices or browsers where this matters more than others. Yeah. So if you are interested, you can of course look at the project on GitHub. There's examples. You've seen these examples. Users with Parcel or the worker plugin thing for Webpack, and communicating with service workers actually as simple as just passing a navigator.service worker as a custom worker, and you're done. So it's really that simple. And of course, the entire thing is under unit test, 100% code coverage, so it's all fine and dandy.
Yeah, so in your example with the wood cutting, I got the impression that the web worker had like one task to figure out the wood cutting. What if you have, like, let's say 3 larger tasks and at different points in the user flow or whatever?
Sure.
Just from a code organization, would you have that as sub-actions of one worker, or would you make 3 workers?
One thing that would probably be a good idea is to then send messages in a specific format. And one format that comes to mind is, for example, the Flux standard action. I'm not sure if you're aware, but it's just a basic object. It says like, okay, you need to send an object which always have, for example, an action, like a type string, and some metadata and some payload. And in that way, on your web worker side, you're just going to say, okay, I'm always going to expect something with a type, and based on this type, I'm going to do either this or this or this. So, yeah.
Rather than having 3 workers.
Rather than having 3 workers. Yeah. Of course, you can make 3 workers, but then you need 3 instances of the web worker thing, which will probably work well. I've not tried it, but sure. Yeah, depends on your use case. Yeah. One in the back was faster. Yeah.
Thanks for the demo. In terms of real-life application of this, Have you used this in any projects, or are you planning to like use it in production?
Well, besides the solo cutting thing, no. Actually, what I can say is this component is actually a derivation of another component that I've built. I've presented on that 2 weeks ago. It's actually async, which is pretty much the same API or a very similar API. It's called React Async, and it does this with promises. Any promise that you give it. So it is pretty much the same API, deals with HTTP requests to do the same thing. And this one I'm using in a lot of different projects. Actually, it's taking off quite well. Like last week there was an issue reported, and another user on GitHub fixed it filed a pull request within an hour. So this thing is actually quite popular already. And it also really works well with React Native, which I've heard. I've not used it in React Native, but someone like, oh, this is awesome in React Native. So,
so as to usage, we are using this a lot. So we use a D called Cloud9, so it's a D inside the browser, and we use web workers there a lot, like really a lot.
Can you say for like what tasks specifically, or?
I mean, like any like language feature which you can like, imagine, I know, like code completion, for example. It's done inside all the calls done inside of web workers.
Cool. Yeah, up here.
Is there a limit to the amount of web workers you can start? And can you also start web workers from a web worker?
Yes, you can start a web worker from a web worker, but I don't know if there is a limit to it. Live coding. Well, in this case, it would just refer to documentation or Stack Overflow or whatever you would do. So yeah. So I'm sorry, I don't have the exact answer to that. Yeah.
I was just going to follow up. Maybe there's a parallel to having like on the server side, if you spin up a lot of threads, like hundreds of threads, is usually a bad idea unless you're doing something really specific. So it's a keep it simple thing, I guess. I don't know.
Yeah, I guess so. Yeah.
It's usually very hard.
Yeah, definitely. I've not really went into that even. I mean, like a couple weeks ago, we were looking at actor systems, which also deal a lot with, like they try to fix the concurrency thing. And well, if you're gonna do something like that, you're on your own. I've not touched that like on purpose because that is way too complicated. And in most use cases, you're not gonna need it because I don't know how many systems are gonna be using hundreds or thousands of web workers. Really? But I don't know. Right, that's it, I guess.
Any last questions? No? Like a big applause for Gert. I think our friends from Sogeti had something in mind to give to the speakers. I'm not too sure about this, but...
No?
Correct me if I'm wrong. We want to give a big thanks for all of you attending tonight again. We have our next meetup on... Tomas has the slides, so I need to check them. On the 7th of November, we will have a TypeScript topic, introduction to TypeScript actually. Thomas did a whole workshop around it, so we'll pick part of this workshop to introduce TypeScript for this community. Angular topic and Vue, but we'll keep you posted on everything that is new. Please don't get up yet, because we need to take our weekly or monthly selfie with everybody. Otherwise, we're just standing there for an empty room.
Anyway, yes, thanks again for everyone showing up. Thank you to all of our friends at Sogeti who kind enough to provide the amazing food. It's a lot better than the pizza we're used to, of course. And of course, thank you to Gert and Egor for providing a wonderful talk, and yourselves for coming along. Sorry, I was outside, I didn't realize the thank yous were going on, but
no worries.
Anyway.
And there's still enough drinks and pizza for now, so make sure to grab something. And well, we from Sogeti always want to thank the speakers. So we've got something for you, Gert.
Alright. Thank you.
Here you go. And it's a little something. And of course something like Igor. And I have the privilege to know Igor, so that's something special.
Yes, everybody in? Yeah, everybody hands up! Yes, perfect. Thanks a lot, guys.
Anyway, grab a drink. Thanks again.
I like you better, but you has a lot of
Well, it seems like everyone wanted to talk to you.